And you know that the result of that would be potentially years in additional delay and certainly an increase in the cost, because every day that goes forward, all of these projects, whatever they are, end up costing more. And so I felt the responsible thing to do was to negotiate hard with them, which we did, and to arrive at a deal that I believe, as I've said many times before, is overall a very fair deal when we're paying 15 cents on the dollar and getting billions of dollars of investment in transit in Toronto so that we can actually move ahead with it. And so the combination of that deal and the billions of dollars in investment with the fact that we get to stay on track in this process and actually be part of the proposal call to build stations. They're actually doing the double tracking to accommodate this service in Scarborough today. And they're going to move ahead to have the proposal call for the stations. And I think that's progress, and it's progress I want to see us continue with because I think there's been way too much delay before for all kinds of questions that were asked. Some of them I'm sure are very valid, but sooner or later you have to make a decision and you have to move ahead. And as I said this morning, in answer to a question, we will also spell out in the coming days how we would at least propose to pay for some of this in the context of the long list of projects, including SmartTrack, that's in front of the city and has been in some cases for many years. Your questions.
There's been concerns raised by councillors on both sides of the spectrum about the Out and West project. They say that it's an expansion project that wasn't among the top 5 of the city's priorities. It wasn't on the original SmartTrack proposal. Originally, the problems were paved instead of the whole crosstown. So, what's the justification for building that?
Well, if you go back to the original justification of having a line that went from Mississauga to Markham, the idea was to connect the number of very important job hubs, employment hubs that existed in the GTA, and to connect people in Toronto up to those job hubs. And the two biggest that were identified that exist today were the Airport Corporate Centre in Mississauga and the kind of technology hub, as it were, in Markham. And so I think that objective still stands as a very valid one and a very important one to people who are seeking not just employment, but seeking an opportunity to get to jobs and have access to their employment. And so when you say it wasn't part of the original SmartTrack, in fact, it was. What did change, I'm quite free to say, because it was me that came forward and acknowledged that the technical impediments and some of the cost impediments of having a heavy rail option to the Airport Corporate Centre and to the airport, made it not feasible. And so I, came forward and honestly and quite transparently said, we're going to make a change. So now I think with the stage-gated process that we have, it offers us the opportunity to commit ourselves to moving forward with that, because I think it is an important connection between the City of Toronto and the job hub in Mississauga. But as we go through the stage-gated process, to look at all the different elements of that project as we proceed. And some questions were asked about that this morning, and they're perfectly fair questions, and we'll continue to deal with those. But I remain committed to connecting opportunity and jobs to people in Toronto, because I think that's what they want me and the city government to do.
When heavy rail proved to be infeasible on Eglinton West, why at that point didn't you say, province has promised to build LRT here and fund it, we'll use our transit dollars somewhere else? Why is the city taking on the cost of that?
Well, I mean, again, to go back through the negotiation that just transpired and the result of that negotiation and the deal we have in front of us now is a very, very complicated thing. And if I had the sort of paper in front of me, I could go through step by step. But the bottom line is all of these different claims that have been made about free LRTs and things the province was going to do on its own, some of those are true and some of those are partly imagined. Because when we look at some of the legal opinions of what they actually had committed to do, legal opinions that came not from me or not from some law colleague of mine from a day past, but from the city's own lawyers, indicate that a lot of the commitments people refer to for free LRTs and free this and free that were not the case. But the bottom line is that we now are where we are. And I repeat the bottom line that I stated a moment ago. We are going to, if this deal is approved by the City Council, as I hope it will be, we are going to have a transit plan that we've agreed on how to fund it and move forward with it. And we've agreed to do that on the basis that city taxpayers are going to pay 15 cents on the dollar in a multi-billion-dollar plan. And if you ask me if 15 cents on the dollar, 15% of the cost, is a fair number for city taxpayers to bear in the context of getting all this transit built that we've avoided building successfully somehow for some reason for many years, I would say yes, it is. And that's why I'm recommending the deal, as is the city manager, as are our professional public service staff recommending the deal to the City Council.
John Tory, does the city take it or leave a deal, as Councillor Campbell said? Can Council make any changes, or
Well,
walk away.
you heard Mr. Wallace kind of avoiding the use of phrases like that, and I will too, because I think what you do have here is a deal that was negotiated painstakingly over months of time, and it got down, as negotiations often do, to sort of one last period of time right at the end about a week or so ago, and that's why the paper was a bit late in coming. So it's been carefully and very diligently negotiated, and so I would say the deal is what's in front of us at the moment, and you always run the risk anytime you negotiate with somebody else and you reach a deal where you kind of shake hands and take forward a term sheet to your respective principles, that if you start changing it around, that the other person just says, well, that wasn't the deal. So I'm presenting this, and Mr. Wallace is presenting it, we're all presenting it to the City Council as a deal that does exist, that we did agree upon, subject to approval of the City Council, obviously, and I think it's a good deal. So to me, while yes, you can always find things you could move around or change or this or that, I think this is the deal, and this is the deal that we're going to be voting on today, and I'm very optimistic it's going to be approved so we can get on with building transit.
Mayor Tory, last week you had mentioned that there's no way that property taxes were going to pay for your SmartTrack plan. We're hearing from councillors today that those taxes are inevitable. Has your stance changed today?
No, because you see, there's somehow, if somebody said, well, the only tax the City of Toronto could levy ever for the rest of our lives for decades to come was the property tax, which I believe is an unsuitable tax to use to finance multi-billion-dollar transit projects, or at least most of that, then I would say, well, maybe they have a point. But the fact is we have other tools at our disposal, others that we've asked for and have got some indication we're going to receive. And I have indicated that I will, for my own sake, as mayor and as one member of council, set out some of my preferences from among the list that will be reported on by the city manager in just a couple of weeks' time. And I think that we'll see when that report comes. I haven't seen a breath of it, but we'll see when it comes. There are other options. We don't have to rely on property taxes, nor do I think we should. I've indicated that we could have a small measure of contribution to the Transit Infrastructure Fund from the levy that is being put forward for property taxes, but I think most of the money should come from other places and other sources collected in other ways, and that's what we'll discuss in the coming 2 weeks.
Sir, your reaction to the Premier's announcement today that she's moving forward with voter radar legislation on your suggestion?
Well, I'm very gratified at the fact that she has understood the difference this can make in terms of safety, especially of children, in school zones. And for that matter, it will also make a positive difference in terms of our ability to better deploy our police resources. But the number one priority was the safety of children in school zones, where a study, I think, that came out from the U of T and Sunnybrook, I think it was, said that the most dangerous time in a child's life is when they're being dropped off at school during the day because of all the traffic and whatnot, and a lot of the commotion that exists, as we've all seen in front of schools. And so I think this will be a good pro-safety measure in school zones, and I look forward to us being able to utilize it. And in so doing, we will also free up some of the time of highly trained police officers who can then be redeployed to work that involves, the kind of police work I think most of them want to do.
Mayor Tory, you mentioned on the streets, Mayor.
I'm sorry.
What's the process? When do you expect that?
Well, I mean, the legislation has to be passed or I'm not sure whether I think it's legislation, not regulation, and so that may take a little time. I hope not too long. But, I would certainly want to move very quickly on this, because I think both the safety of children, and we've seen a lot of problems this year, tragic problems with the safety of all pedestrians, young and old, and I want to move ahead with this as quickly as possible. And also it allows us to get on with what we are doing with the police service. So I think both are important priorities for us, especially the safety. And so I hope, early in the new year, but it depends on the timetable and getting the equipment and all those things.
So your thoughts on the U.S. election and how the outcome may affect the country's relationship with Canada and vice versa?
Well, look, if you were just watching the election, you would have reason to believe that if Mr. Trump were to succeed, we would have a more difficult relationship, because he's talked about ripping up trade agreements and this kind of thing. And so I would think that's entirely possible based on everything we heard during the campaign. But I think the most important thing to focus on, and this was one of the questions I was asked by the journalism students as well, I think the most important thing to focus on is how can that country heal itself? Because I think, unlike elections that we've seen most of the time here, this has caused a lot more sort of wounds in the country. It's been much more divisive and polarized. And I think that Hillary Clinton represents a better opportunity to see those wounds healed. And that's important to us as well. A strong, united, prosperous, positive-looking United States of America is very important to the well-being of Toronto. That's just a fact. It starts with economic investment and jobs and trade. It goes through tourism. And it just goes through the fact that they're our neighbors, and we see so much of their media and what goes on there, I think is reflected in people's thoughts here. And so I want them to come back from this experience of this election. And look, it's an election, so I guess that's a good news story in that they have them, like we do. But it's been certainly very polarizing, and I think that is something that's going to take some time. And I think Hillary Clinton represents a better opportunity to do that faster.
Mayor Tory, to
More
remind me
questions?
of your really kind of tough campaign with Rob Ford, there's a lot of parallels that you can draw between what's happening there and what's happening here.
But you know what? I'll say this. Speaking of Rob Ford, and I've many times told the story about how we used to sit up at those debating tables and he would turn to me and kind of say, well, I'm really going to lay you out cold in a moment, prepare yourself for it and so on. Rob Ford, for all of his partisanship, and he was very partisan about what he believed in and so on, the level of division never got itself, at least as between two candidates, to anything even approaching what you've seen here. Now, the other Mr. Ford, I think, is a bit more inclined to be more divisive. And I just don't think that's what people in Toronto or anywhere want. I think they want leaders, they want candidates, they want people in business and in labor and in government who are saying, what can we do together to make your life better? What can we do to move the city, the province, the country forward? And that's what I'm trying to do here. And I'm not going to do it with perfection, nor would anybody else necessarily, but that's what I'm trying to do, is to sort of build a consensus wherever I can. And the consensus here, means that when you have a vote, whether it's on a transit plan or anything else, that you get hopefully as strong a majority of the votes as you can, but a majority is what makes the decision. And so I've been seeking to build those majorities to favor policies I have on transit and housing, and I'll continue to do so.
Sir, if council rejects the funding arrangement for the transit plan, is SmartTrack effectively dead in the water at that point, or not necessarily?
You see, I don't consider that kind of, I've done my homework. I'm working hard. I'm going to continue to put forward persuasive arguments with my colleagues as to why people should vote for this. And I'm optimistic it's going to be approved by the City Council probably today. So that's what I think is going to happen. And we will then move forward. We will move forward with the expenditure of the $71 million this particular report commits us to. And we will move forward to do all of the other things that are talked about in the report, which have the combined impact of moving forward with transit and building transit. And again, I know you get bored hearing me say this. The people of Toronto, who I have probably more contact with than anybody else in this building on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, the number one thing they want me to do is to ease the strangulation that is taking place in the city as a result of traffic congestion. And the number one way in which you can do that is to build public transportation and move on with it and stop this constant, refrain of delay, study, debate. And I don't think that's what I was sent here to do. And so in a reasonable, responsible way, we're going to move forward with this.
I just want to clarify if I heard that answer on Eglinton West. When you talk about LRT pledges being partly imagined, is it your opinion specifically on Eglinton West that the province would not have paid for that?
I was speaking, obviously, when I talked about what I call imagined, that people wanted to read documentation as saying that there was a promise of free transit, especially when it came to some of the operating costs. That's specifically what I was referring to there. And I think that if you look at both the legal opinions of our solicitors and if you look at, any fair reading, even of the documentation I was looking at this morning, where it talks about, discussions to be followed and agreements that have to be entered into, there was nothing much definite. And you know what? Even if there was something really definite, the fact of the matter is, as we've seen before, and it's one of the reasons I want to get on with these projects, when governments change, or even when governments don't change, policies change. And so whatever the determination was about the operating costs in years gone by, and people could debate about that based on the wording that was somewhat ambiguous, the fact is that in their budget of this past spring, the provincial government made it very clear they would be seeking operating funding to be at the responsibility of municipalities, including Toronto. And so I look at that and say, well, that may or may not have represented a change in policy. And I would suggest to you something else. If they had decided to take on operating responsibility for multiple transit systems in Toronto, do you not think that they would have made that the subject of a sort of a ticker tape parade accompanied announcement at Queen's Park? Because this would have been received by me and every other member of that council as a dramatic breakthrough that's been sought for almost decades now. Would they have just buried it quietly inside some legal agreements, or might they have come forward and said, hallelujah, we've seen the light, we've decided to fund operating costs for transit systems? And they didn't do that. And so I would suggest to you that the notion that this was kind of some sort of slam dunk that was all accounted for in all the agreements and that was that is just not the case. And so, I think those who sort of say it was all black and white in terms of exactly what they'd give us number one, I'm not sure that was true in all of these cases, that people tend to paint it that way because it suits their purposes. And number two, they also have to be realistic in that we are dealing with a government or other governments that can change their mind just as we can on things. And so I think that when they change their mind, you have to deal with the cards that you're dealt. And that's what we've done here, which is to negotiate a good agreement for the City of Toronto at 15 cents on the dollar cost to city taxpayers that can move transit forward. And to me, that is something worth voting for, and I think you're going to see that vote take place in the council chamber, I hope, later today. Thanks very much.